Royal Hearts. What would you have done if the only way for your mate not to be executed was by giving pleasure to the executioner, only to be released and find he had become a beast towards you? Switch off the world and be engulfed completely by this magnetic tale of love, betrayal, and heartbreak. Now let's begin. The phone had shattered her world. 1 minute she was rehearsing Chopin, the notes a safe, orderly world she controlled. The next, Liam's frantic, garbled call from a police precinct, his voice cracking with a terror she'd never heard. Fraud, embezzlement, millions. The evidence was a tidal wave. Digital footprints, forged transfers, all leading directly to his terminal. He was the perfect fall guy, loyal, trusting, and now utterly doomed. It was Liam's terrified lawyer, his suit wrinkled from a sleepless night, who whispered the name. The only man who held the keys to this prison. The architect of it all, Cain Thorne. His name was a legend in the city, a billionaire who built empires out of rubble and broken competitors. His fortress was the Thorne Spire, a needle of black glass and steel piercing the sky. Sierra didn't have an appointment. She used raw, desperate audacity. She marched past the first 3 layers of security, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until she stood in his private, soundless elevator, soaring to the penthouse. The doors opened into a cavern of impossible wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the entire city lying at its feet. The air was cold, sterile, and in the center of it all, standing with his back to her, was Cain. He turned slowly. He wasn't what she expected. Not a bloated titan, but a blade of a man. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, a face carved from granite and absolute authority. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and she felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice trembling. "I know who you are." His voice was a low, calm rumble, devoid of warmth. "You're the pianist, engaged to Liam Hayes." He took a slow step toward her. "You have 30 seconds to tell me why you're in my home." The story tumbled out of her. The arrest, the evidence, Liam's innocence. Cain listened, unmoved. When she finished, he gave a faint, cold smile. "He's not innocent. He was negligent. A pawn. And pawns are sacrificed." "You can fix this," she pleaded, tears finally breaking through. "You control the evidence. You can make it disappear." He closed the final distance between them. He was so close she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, see the flecks of silver in his icy blue eyes. "I can," he admitted, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes, holding her captive. "But I don't deal in favors. I deal in assets. And currency. I have money, my family." "I shh on your money," he whispered, the vulgarity a deliberate shock in the pristine silence. "I have a different demand in mind." His hand came up to trace the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. A shiver, violent and unwanted, racked her body. "You will leave your life. You will move into this penthouse. You will cut all contact with him. You will be my companion, my exclusive distraction." Horror dawned on her, cold and slick. "You're insane." "Am I?" he murmured, his face inches from hers. "I don't want your money, Sierra. I want your obedience. Your fiancé's freedom depends on the quality of your performance in the other room." His voice dropped to a predatory growl that vibrated in her very bones. "I own your pleasure now. Your moans are the currency for his pardon." Before she could scream, before she could move, his hand snaked behind her neck, pulling her in. His kiss was not an attempt at seduction. It was a conquest, a brutal, punishing claim of her mouth, a demonstration of absolute power. It was hard and demanding, stealing her breath, her thoughts, her will. She struggled, her hands pushing against the immovable wall of his chest, a pathetic whimper trapped in her throat. As she fought, his phone, lying on a nearby table, vibrated with an incoming call. He broke the kiss, his breathing perfectly even, His eyes locked on her stunned, violated face. He answered, putting it on speaker. A voice came through, crisp and professional. "Mr. Thorne, the package is ready for delivery to the district attorney. Do I have your final authorization?" Kane's lips curved into a slow, cruel smile. His eyes devoured Sierra's terror. "Hold the transfer," he said, his voice calm and absolute. "I'm reconsidering." The silence in the penthouse was the first prison. It was a vacuum, sucking the sound of her own breathing from her lungs. The lawyer had been swift, efficient. A single, sleek suitcase stood in the center of the cavernous living room, containing the fragments of a life she'd been forced to abandon. Her phone was gone. Her freedom was gone. All that remained was the view of a city she could no longer touch. And him. Kane was a ghost in his own home. He moved through the sterile spaces with a predator's quiet grace, his presence a constant, chilling pressure. That evening, a silent attendant laid a table for two with obscenely expensive china. Kane held out a chair for her. It wasn't a gesture of chivalry. It was a command. The dinner was an execution by conversation. "Tell me about your recitals," he began, his voice calm, conversational. The small halls, the polite, scattered applause. Did it ever feel small to you? A life measured in minor keys and modest ambitions? She said nothing, pushing food around her plate. "Liam," he continued, as if discussing the weather, "was always content with small. A small apartment, a small career, a small, safe love. It's why he was so easy to frame. He never looked up, never saw the bigger game." He took a sip of wine, his eyes pinning her. "You, however, you have the hands of a virtuoso, but you play for a village. Why?" "You don't know anything about us," she whispered, her voice raw. "I know he proposed with a tiny diamond because he was saving for a practical future," Kane said, his tone lethally gentle. "I know he talked you out of the Berlin audition because it was too far from home. I know he was building you a cage long before I ever did. His was just made of fear and mediocrity. Mine, at least, is honest." The words were poison darts, each one striking a secret, half-formed doubt she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The walls of her memory were being chipped away, and she hated him for it. The next morning, he summoned her to his office. A single monitor glowed on his desk. "I thought you should understand the full stakes of our arrangement," he said, and turned the screen toward her. It was a live feed, a stark, gray cell, and there was Liam, hunched on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up, and the hollow despair in his eyes was a physical blow. He was fading, breaking. The vibrant man she loved was being erased. "The DA is pushing for the maximum sentence." Kane's voice cut through her horror. 20 years. Federal prison, he wouldn't survive 5. Tears she could no longer control streamed down her face. This was the reality. Not a bargain. An extinction. The day passed in a blur of silent agony. As dusk painted the skyline in fire, Kane found her staring out at the city. Numb. He didn't touch her. He simply stood beside her, his presence an iceberg in the room. "The first payment is due tonight," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "My room. 10 o'clock. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, delivering the final devastating blow. "And Sierra," he said without looking back, "I expect you to be willing." The click of the door closing was the sound of a tomb sealing. She was alone, with the ghost of Liam's broken eyes, the echo of Kane's command, and the terrifying knowledge that her fiancé's only hope for survival now depended on a performance she didn't know if she could give. The gilded cage had just become a stage for her own soul's execution. 10 o'clock. The walk to his wing of the penthouse was a march to the gallows. Each step on the cold marble echoed the frantic beat of her heart. She wore the silk robe that had been laid out for her, a prisoner's uniform of impossible softness. She pushed the heavy door open. His room was like him, monolithic, severe, dominated by a bed that was less a place of rest and more an altar of domination. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the city's neon veins, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't turn. "Close the door." His voice was calm, a command that brooked no hesitation. She obeyed, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silence. "The robe. Take it off." Her fingers trembled, fumbling with the tie. The silk slithered from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She stood there, exposed in the cool air, her arms crossed over her chest, a last futile defense. Finally he turned. His eyes were not filled with lust but with a terrifying analytical focus. He looked at her as if she were a complex equation he was about to solve. "Lie down." She moved to the bed, her body stiff, and lay on her back, staring at the dark ceiling. She would be a stone, a statue. She would feel nothing. This was for Liam. She heard the soft clink of his glass being set down, felt the dip of the mattress as he joined her. His scent, clean and sharp, enveloped her. His hand, cool and dry, touched her stomach. She flinched, a violent recoil she couldn't suppress. A low, humorless sound rumbled in his chest. "Passivity is not acceptance, Sierra. It's an insult. I require participation." His touch began its work. It was not rough, but it was unyielding. His hands were a craftsman's, learning the geography of her resistance. He traced the rigid line of her hip, the tight cord of her thigh. He ignored the places she expected to be touched, focusing instead on the hidden, neutral territories of her body. The inside of her elbow, the sensitive hollow behind her knee, the delicate arch of her foot. And he spoke. His voice was a low, relentless whisper against her skin. "Such a waste of tension. Your body is a concert instrument, tuned for a symphony, and you let it sit silent. Such a stubborn pulse here. See how it quickens? Your body is far more honest than you are." She bit her lip until she tasted blood, fighting the traitorous shivers that wanted to break through. But he was a master of pressure and release. His thumbs found a knot of tension at the base of her spine and worked it with brutal precision, sending a wave of unwilling relaxation through her. A soft, choked sound escaped her. "There," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "A down payment." He was dismantling her, piece by piece. When his mouth finally found the tips of her chest, it was not with passion, but with a devastating, precise action that bypassed her mind and sent a jolt of pure electric sensation straight to her core. A gasp was torn from her. "No," she pleaded, her resolve crumbling. "Yes," he countered, his voice absolute. His hand slid between her legs and she was mortified to find herself wet, her body arching into his touch against her will. "Your flesh confesses what your mouth denies." He was relentless, his fingers a skilled, cruel instrument, playing her with a conductor's timing. She fought it, she hated it, but the pleasure was a riptide, pulling her under. Her hips began to move, a tiny betraying rhythm. Whimpers she didn't recognize as her own fell from her lips. "Say my name," he commanded, his voice thick with a dark triumph. She shook her head, tears of shame streaming into her hair. He increased the pressure, the rhythm, pushing her to the very brink and holding her there, suspended in an agony of need. "Cain," she cried out, the name a sob of surrender. It was the permission he needed. The climax shattered her, a wave of violent, unwelcome pleasure that racked her body, leaving her trembling and utterly broken. It felt not like a release, but like a violation of her very soul. He withdrew immediately. The loss of contact was its own kind of shock. He stood looking down at her wrecked form with that same unnerving calm. "You can go." She scrambled from the bed, grabbing her robe, fleeing back to her own room without a backward glance. She felt filthy, complicit, hollowed out. Stumbling to the computer terminal in her sitting room, her hands shaking, she pulled up the live feed from the detention center. and she froze. Liam was no longer in the stark cell. He was in a brighter, cleaner room. A guard was handing him a tray of hot food. He looked up, and for the first time, there was a flicker of confused hope in his eyes. The connection was not just real. It was instantaneous. Her degradation had bought him a hot meal. Her unwanted pleasure had bought him a glimpse of light. The transaction was complete, and the cost was a piece of her soul. She stared at the screen, a cold, profound terror settling in her bones. This was only the first payment. The days bled into a torturous rhythm. The clock would strike 10. She would walk the marble hall. The transaction would occur, a cold, masterful dismantling of her will that always ended in that shattering, shameful release. And each time, she would flee to the screen, a desperate addict checking her fix, to see Liam's conditions improve. A book, a longer exercise period, the ghost of color returning to his cheeks. Her hatred for Cain was a fire in her gut. But it was now a fire banked with embers of something else, a terrifying, confusing addiction to the very physical oblivion he provided. In those moments of climax, her mind went blessedly, horribly blank. No fear for Liam, no guilt, no past, no future. Just sensation. And the need for that silence was becoming a hunger that scared her more than Cain himself. She began to watch him outside the confines of his bedroom. She saw the relentless focus, the way he worked through the night, the lights in his office burning long after the city below had gone dark. She noticed he never had visitors, no friends, no family. The penthouse wasn't a home. It was a command center for a solitary war against the world. Driven by a need to understand the monster, she ventured into his private library, a room of leather and silence. Her fingers trailed over spines of treatises on corporate law and economic theory. And then, tucked away, she found a portfolio of old financial magazines. One headline caught her eye. Thorne's Ruthless Gambit, Saving Orion Holdings from Implosion. Her blood ran cold. Orion Holdings, Liam's company. She devoured the article. It spoke not of fraud, but of catastrophic mismanagement by the previous board. A pension fund serving tens of thousands was weeks from evaporating. Cain's hostile takeover, while brutal and widely condemned, had injected the capital and instituted the drastic reforms necessary to save it. The fraud Liam was accused of? It was a smokescreen, a necessary evil to legally oust the corrupt old guard and protect the company's lifeblood. The world tilted. Liam wasn't just a pawn. He was collateral damage in a war that had saved thousands of innocent people. Cain wasn't just a monster. He was a savior who got his hands dirty so others wouldn't starve. The moral clarity of her hatred fractured into 1,000 confusing shards. Her eyes fell on another magazine, tucked behind the rest. The cover was softer, a society piece. A younger, strikingly handsome Cain smiled, his arm around a woman with a luminous, gentle beauty. The headline was a gut punch. Golden couple's future bright. CEO Cain Thorne and wife Elena. Beneath it, a date from 7 years ago. Heart pounding, she pulled it out. The article was a standard puff piece until the final paragraph. It mentioned Elena was an avid equestrian, looking forward to a vacation at their country estate. A vacation she never took. A shadow fell over the page. Sierra froze, the magazine clutched in her hands. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. The air itself went cold. Slowly, she looked up. Cain stood in the doorway, his face a mask of frozen stone. But his eyes were locked on the photograph of his dead wife, and in their icy depths was a chasm of such raw, unadulterated agony that it stole the air from the room. The controlled CEO, the ruthless captor, was gone. For a single, breathtaking second, he was just a man, utterly shattered by a loss that had clearly never healed. The magazine slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering to the floor. The spell broke. His gaze snapped to hers, the agony vanishing behind a wall of fury more terrifying than anything she had seen before. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The magazine lay between them on the floor like a fallen grenade. The air in the library was charged, thick with the ghost of a woman named Elena and the raw, exposed nerve Sierra had just uncovered. Kane didn't move. His fury was a physical force, a contained storm that made the vast room feel claustrophobic. As already known, Sierra braced for the explosion, for the cold rage, the cruel words, the punishing touch. He turned and walked away. The silence he left behind was more terrifying than any outburst. The next evening at 10 o'clock, she entered his room as always. When she entered his room, he was already waiting. But the predatory stillness was different. He didn't command her to undress. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "Come here." She approached, her body thrumming with a new kind of tension. His hands, when they touched her, were different. Still demanding, still in absolute control, but the clinical precision was gone, replaced by a deliberate, almost curious possession. He traced the line of her collarbone, his thumb stroking the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. "You play the piano," he stated, his voice low. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. "Why that piece? The one you were rehearsing when you got the call." The question was so unexpected, so personal, it disarmed her completely. "Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor," she whispered. "It's full of longing, a beautiful sadness." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. His hands slid down her arms, then back up, a slow, possessive mapping. "And the Berlin audition? The one he talked you out of. What would you have played?" The intimacy of the question was a violation worse than any physical act. He was dismantling her, not with cruelty, but with a terrifying, focused interest. She found herself answering, her voice shaky, telling him about the ambitious concerto, the dream she had packed away. The encounter that night was the first one that did not end with her fleeing in shame. It ended with her lying beside him in the dark, her body humming, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of confusion. This new pattern continued. The transactions were no longer just at night. He would summon her to his office during the day, not for romance, but to talk. He asked about her childhood, her training, the first time she fell in love. He was assembling a dossier on her soul. And with each revelation, the hatred she clung to became more tangled with a frightening, burgeoning understanding. Then one afternoon he led her not to his office or his bedroom, but to the private elevator. They descended to a floor she didn't know existed. The doors opened into a breathtaking, intimate concert hall, all rich wood and perfect acoustics. In the center of the stage stood a magnificent, gleaming grand piano. "Play," he commanded, his voice echoing in the empty space. It wasn't a request. It was the same voice he used for everything, but the context transformed it. Hesitantly, she walked to the piano, her fingers trailing over the cool, polished ivory. She sat. The silence of the hall was expectant. She looked out and saw him, not sitting in one of the plush seats, but leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, watching her with that unnerving total focus. She began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, the ghost of Liam's fear and her own captivity clinging to them. But then the music took over, the muscle memory in her fingers, the deep, resonant sound of the exquisite instrument, the sheer, liberating space. It all coalesced. She forgot him. She forgot the penthouse, the bargain, the live feed. She poured every ounce of her confusion, her fear, her longing, her rediscovered strength into the keys. The beautiful sadness of Chopin filled the hall, a raw, unfiltered confession. When the final note faded into silence, she was breathless, her chest heaving, tears she hadn't known she was crying drying on her cheeks. She looked up. Kane hadn't moved. But the man leaning against the wall was not the tyrant. The cold calculation in his eyes had been replaced by something dark, deep, and utterly captivated. He looked ravished, as if she had just stripped him bare with her music. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the empty hall, the air crackling with the unspoken aftermath of her performance. Then he pushed off the wall. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't touch her. He stopped just before the stage, his eyes holding hers. "Liam's bail hearing is tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual power and pretense. "He will be released." He turned and walked out of the concert hall, leaving her alone on the stage, the echo of his words and the ghost of her music hanging in the air. The promise she had sacrificed everything for had just been granted. So why did she feel so utterly, completely shattered? That night, when she went to his room, everything was different. There was no cold command, no psychological dissection. The air was thick with a charge that had been building since the concert hall. He was waiting for her, and the moment the door closed, he was on her. But this wasn't the controlled domination of before. This was frantic, almost desperate. His mouth found hers in a searing, hungry kiss that she returned with equal fervor. It was a clash of teeth and tongue, a battle for air, for sensation. This was dual ownership. Her hands weren't passive. They clawed at his back, pulling him closer. Her hips arched against his, meeting his rhythm with a wild abandon of her own. The confusing mix of gratitude for Liam's freedom, the addictive physical need he had cultivated in her, and the shocking, undeniable connection forged through music. It all exploded into a single driving force. She was no longer just a body to be used. She was a partner in this frantic emotional release. When he drove into her, it was with a raw, guttural sound that was half groan, half prayer, and when she cried out his name as she fell apart, it wasn't a sob of surrender, but a fierce, claiming scream. In the tangled, breathless aftermath as they lay clinging to each other, she understood the shift had not just been in him. It had been in her, too. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The world outside the penthouse was a blur of noise and motion. Sitting in the back of the tinted town car, Sierra watched the city stream by, feeling like a ghost returned to the land of the living. When the car stopped at a modest apartment building, Liam was already there, standing on the sidewalk flanked by his lawyer. He looked thinner, older, the light in his eyes replaced by a haunted, skittish flicker. When he saw her, he stumbled forward, crushing her in a desperate embrace. "Sierra," he choked out, his body trembling. His touch felt foreign. The scent of him, cheap soap and anxiety, was unfamiliar. She held him, murmuring reassurances, but her eyes were dry. All she could feel was the ghost of Cain's hands on her skin, the echo of the piano's final note. Inside his apartment, the illusion shattered. He jumped at the buzz of the refrigerator. The ring of his own phone made him sweat. He couldn't sit still, pacing like a caged animal. "They're still out there, Sierra," he whispered, his eyes wide. "They could come for me again. We have to get out of here, now, tonight. We can go to Canada, just disappear." He grabbed her shoulders, his grip too tight. "You'll come with me. We'll leave all this behind. Just you and me, like it was supposed to be." His words, once a promise of a shared future, now felt like a sentence. The small apartment, the safe, modest life he described. It felt like a coffin. The panic that rose in her throat wasn't fear of Cain, but a visceral terror at the thought of being sealed inside that life again, of never seeing the city from 100 stories up, of never feeling that devastating, soul-shaking connection again. I need to get my things," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "From the place I've been staying." Liam's face tightened. "The place you've been staying? What does that mean? Who did you have to beg, Sierra? What did you have to do?" The unspoken truth hung between them, ugly and suffocating. She couldn't answer. Returning to the penthouse was like returning from a war to a silent, opulent fortress. Kane was in his study, his back to the door, staring at the skyline. He didn't turn. "Liam is out," she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I know." The silence stretched, taut and heavy. "He wants me to leave with him. Tonight." This time he turned. His face was unreadable, the granite mask firmly back in place, but his eyes, those icy blue depths, held a strange, flat emptiness. "Then you should go." The words were a physical blow. She swayed on her feet. "The deal is complete," he continued, his tone utterly neutral, as if discussing a concluded business merger. "Liam is free. Your debt is paid. You are released from our arrangement." He walked to his desk, picked up a simple, thick envelope and held it out to her. "There is a passport, cash, and untraceable credit cards in here, more than enough to disappear. A final severance." She stared at the envelope, then at him. This was what she wanted. Freedom. Safety. Liam. So why did it feel like he was tearing her heart out with his bare hands? "The door is open, Sierra," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "But if you walk through it now, you do not come back. If you choose to stay." He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment she saw the ghost of the man from the concert hall. "If you stay, it will be for me. Not for a deal, not for a bargain. It will be your choice. And mine." He turned his back on her once more, a king dismissing a subject. The audience was over. Numb, she walked to her room, the room that had been her prison. The single suitcase stood where she'd left it. With trembling hands, she began to pack. A few simple items. The silk robe she'd worn that first night felt like a betrayal under her fingers. She folded it, placed it in the case. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was a battlefield. Liam's face, full of fragile, desperate hope. The life he offered, safe, small, and forever shadowed by the trauma they'd endured. Kane's back turned to her in the study. The penthouse. A gilded cage that had become the stage for her deepest shame and her most powerful awakening. The man. A monster who had seen her, truly seen her in a way Liam never had. She thought of the piano, the way the music had torn through her, and the look on Kane's face as he listened. She thought of the frantic, desperate union after, a connection so profound it terrified her. She looked at Liam's hopeful face in her mind's eye. Then she looked around the room, at the view of the glittering city, at the bed where her body had learned a new devastating language, at the door behind which stood the most complicated, dangerous man she would ever know. Her hand stilled on the half-zipped suitcase. She couldn't do it. She couldn't make the decision. The freedom she had fought for was here, in her hands, and it felt heavier than any chain Kane had ever placed on her. She stood there, trapped between two worlds, two men, two versions of herself, utterly and completely paralyzed. The chains were off, but she had never felt more imprisoned. The suitcase lay open and abandoned on the floor, a silent testament to her paralysis. Sierra stood in the center of the room, her entire being a war zone. The door to her gilded cage was open, but her feet were rooted to the marble floor. The weight of Kane's ultimatum pressed down on her, a choice with no right answer. She didn't hear him enter. She only felt his presence, a shift in the air. He stood in the doorway watching her. The cold CEO was gone. In his place was a man stripped bare, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. "You're still here," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't know why," she whispered, the admission torn from her. He walked into the room, his gaze falling on the discarded suitcase. He didn't touch her. Instead, he went to the window, looking out as if the city held the words he needed. "It was never about him," Kane began, his voice low and rough. Liam was a symptom, a loose thread. He told her everything. His voice was a flat, painful monotone, recounting a horror story. His wife, Elena, her love for horses, the accident at their country estate, a saddle strap professionally tampered with, that snapped during a gentle canter. The investigation that went nowhere, blocked by powerful interests. The man who ordered it sits on the board of a rival conglomerate. The same man. Kane turned, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Who was using Liam's company Orion as a clean vessel to launder money for a human trafficking ring? A ring that preys on the very people whose pensions I was accused of destroying. Sierra's hand flew to her mouth. The world tilted. The monstrous captor was a phantom. The real monster was a faceless executive using lives as currency. Liam's negligence was a security hole they exploited. To get to them, I had to take control of Orion. To take control, I needed a reason to oust the old board. The fraud was the key. I made Liam the fall guy because he was the easiest, most visible target. He finally looked at her, his expression stark with a terrible honesty. I used him. I used you. I became the monster in the story because the real monsters wear suits and sit in boardrooms. The truth was a wrecking ball, shattering the last of her hatred. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had walked into the darkness to fight a greater evil, and the darkness had clung to him. As if on cue, Kane's phone buzzed. He listened, his face hardening. He's moving. Vex knows Liam is out. He's having his people plant new evidence. He's going to frame him for the trafficking, not just the fraud. This time it's a life sentence. The war was no longer in her heart. It was here now. What followed was a tense, surreal alliance. Liam, terrified but sobered by the truth, was brought to the penthouse. The three of them, the captive turned accomplice, and the tyrant, huddled in Kane's war room. Liam, with his analyst's mind, cross-referenced data. Sierra, with her knowledge of the penthouse's secrets, helped Kane access encrypted files. Kane, with his ruthless intellect, directed the operation. It was Liam who found the digital needle in the haystack, a buried transfer, a single keystroke log that placed Vex at the center of the entire operation. They had him. But Vex was a cornered rat. He didn't send lawyers. He came himself, bursting into the penthouse with 2 armed men, his genial mask gone, replaced by a snarl of rage. "You think you've won, Thorn? I'll see you all buried." Chaos erupted. One of the guards lunged for Sierra. Kane moved with feral speed, tackling the man. The other guard went for Liam, but Vex, his eyes wild, pulled a small, sleek pistol from his jacket, aiming not at Kane, but at Sierra. Time slowed. Kane was still grappling with the first guard. Sierra was frozen. It was Liam who moved. With a cry that was part terror, part triumph, he threw himself in front of her. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Liam jerked, a spray of crimson blossoming on his chest, his eyes wide with shock before he crumpled to the floor. Sierra's scream was swallowed by the sound of Kane disarming the second guard and turning on Vex with a roar of pure, primal fury. Liam was in surgery. The doctor said it was touch and go. Sierra sat on a hard plastic chair, her clothes stained with Liam's blood, her body trembling with shock. Kane stood a few feet away, his knuckles white where he gripped the windowsill, his own suit jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up. He had saved them. He had secured the evidence. Vex was in custody. It was over. But Liam might still die. The guilt was a physical weight crushing her. She had chosen to stay. Her inaction had led to this. Kane turned from the window. His face was haggard, etched with a pain she now understood. He saw her shaking, saw the tears tracking through the blood on her cheeks. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her up from the chair and into his arms. It wasn't a gentle embrace, it was a collision. A desperate clinging of 2 people who had seen the worst of the world in each other and had nowhere else to go. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled by his shirt. His arms tightened around her, his hand cradling the back of her head. Then he tilted her face up. His eyes were dark pools of fear, relief, and a terrifying, undeniable love that had grown in the darkest soil imaginable. This was the claiming. His kiss was nothing like the others. It wasn't punishing. It wasn't calculated. It was a raw, emotional wreckage, a desperate confession. It tasted of salt tears, of adrenaline, of the metallic tang of blood, and of a truth too powerful to be spoken. It was a kiss that said, I was afraid I lost you, and I can't do this without you. And this is real. This is us. This is everything. She kissed him back with the same desperate fervor, her fingers digging into his arms, anchoring herself to him in the storm. It was a kiss that sealed their fractured souls together, a bond forged not in pleasure, but in shared survival, sacrifice, and a love that had somehow impossibly bloomed in the aftermath of ruin. In the cold, sterile light of the hospital, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, they finally, truly, found each other. The kiss in the waiting room was a universe. It was a desperate, breathless confession that spanned from the depths of hell to a fragile, terrifying peak of hope. It was the answer to every unspoken question, the balm on every shared wound. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling, their hands clinging as if the world might tear them apart again. No words were needed. The truth was in the tremor of their hands, the salt of their shared tears. A soft cough from the doorway shattered the moment. A surgeon, still in his green scrubs, mask pulled down, looked at them with tired but kind eyes. He's out of surgery. It was touch and go, but he's stable. The bullet missed his major arteries by a millimeter. He's a very lucky man. The relief that washed over Sierra was so profound her knees buckled. Kane's arm was instantly around her waist, holding her steady. The strength of it, the rightness, felt like a promise. He'll need a lot of recovery, both physically and psychologically, the surgeon continued, but he's going to live. He's going to live. The words echoed the new fragile life she felt blooming in her own chest. 2 weeks later. The media narrative was a whirlwind Kane expertly managed. Liam Hayes, the brave financial analyst who uncovered a human trafficking ring and took a bullet bringing the mastermind, Arthur Vex, to justice. He was a hero. The old fraud charges were not just dropped. They were expunged, the records sealed. Kane Thorne was portrayed as the savvy CEO who provided crucial assistance, a narrative that conveniently glossed over the darker details. Liam was moved to a private suite in the same world-class hospital, a sun-drenched room that felt a world away from the sterile ICU. The physical healing had begun. The pallor was leaving his skin, replaced by healthy color. But his eyes were the windows to a soul that had been shattered and was still reassembling itself. Sierra visited every day. She would sit by his bed, hold his hand, and they would talk about everything and nothing. They talked about the weather, about old friends, about the book he was reading. They carefully avoided the chasm that had opened up between them, the chasm named Kane. Today was different. The doctors said he was strong enough to be discharged in a few days. The future, which had been a suspended animation, was now rushing toward them. The lawyer says I can go back to work whenever I'm ready, Liam said, his voice still weak but clear. He was looking out the window, not at her. They've offered me a promotion, a vice president position, a clean slate. That's wonderful, Liam, Sierra said, her voice earnest. You deserve that. He finally turned to look at her. His gaze was clear, direct, and unbearably sad. Do I? He paused, gathering his strength. They also said Thorne is setting up a multi-million-dollar trust for me. For my suffering, he said. Sierra's breath hitched. Kane hadn't told her that. It was so like him, a grand, brutal, guilt-ridden gesture, a final payment. Sierra, Liam said, his voice dropping to a whisper. When you kissed him, in the waiting room, I was fading in and out, but I saw it. Her heart stopped. She opened her mouth to deny, to explain, but no sound came out. The truth was a living thing in the room, and it refused to be caged. I'm not angry, he said, and the profound sadness in his voice was worse than any anger could have been. How could I be? He saved my life. And you saved me in a different way. He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain in his chest. But I saw the way you looked at him, and I see the way you look now when you think I'm not watching. You're here, in this room with me, but you're not here. You're with him. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over. Liam, I love you. I always have. I know, he said, a single tear tracing a path down his own cheek. And I will always love you. You were my future. But that future, it was built on a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. The woman who packed a small bag for a small life. He took a ragged breath. You love him. I see it. It's in the set of your shoulders, in the fire in your eyes when you talk about that damned penthouse. And part of you loves the woman you became with him. The strong one. The one who plays symphonies in private halls and stands her ground against monsters. He reached out, his hand trembling, and wiped a tear from her cheek. I can't be with that woman. I look at her, and all I see is the man I was, the scared, negligent pawn. I need to find who I am without all this, without you trying to shrink yourself back into a box to make me feel whole. It was the most painful, most truthful thing anyone had ever said to her. It was a release and a severance all at once. She bowed her head, sobs racking her body, mourning the death of a love that was real, but was now part of a past they could never reclaim. Be with him, Sierra, Liam whispered. Be the woman he helped you become. Just let me go. She nodded, unable to speak, and leaned forward to press one last gentle final kiss to his forehead. It was a goodbye. Then she stood, walked out of the sunlit room, and left her past behind. She returned to the penthouse, her emotions a maelstrom of grief and a terrifying wild hope. Liam had set her free. He had seen the truth and he had blessed it. She walked through the doors, expecting to find Kane, ready to fall into his arms and finally start their story. But the penthouse was different. It was silent in a way it had never been before. The usual low hum of energy was gone. She found him not in his office nor in his bedroom but in the concert hall, sitting alone in the front row, staring at the empty stage. The grand piano was closed. Liam? He asked, his voice flat. He let me go, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She walked down the aisle toward him. He saw it. He saw us. And he let me go. She expected him to stand, to take her in his arms, to claim this hard-won victory. Instead, he remained seated, his profile carved from stone. Good, he said, the single word landing like a hammer. That's for the best. Confusion, cold and sharp, pierced through her. What? He finally turned to look at her, and the emptiness in his eyes stole her breath. It was the same emptiness she'd seen when he'd given her the passport. But now it was deeper. Absolute. You should be with him, Sierra. The world tilted. What are you talking about? I just told you. He doesn't want me. Not like that. Not anymore. He's a good man, Kane continued, as if he hadn't heard her. A normal man. He can give you a normal life. A life without this. He gestured vaguely around the hall, a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire twisted saga of their beginning. I don't want a normal life, she cried, her voice echoing in the vast space. I want you, after everything, the kiss, you felt it. I know you did. For a fleeting second, agony flashed across his face, so raw it was like a crack of lightning in a dark sky. Then it was gone, sealed behind a wall of impenetrable ice. That was adrenaline, fear, a moment of weakness, he said, his voice cold and precise. I dragged you into my war. I blackmailed you. I used your body as currency. I turned you into someone your own fiancé doesn't recognize. He stood up, turning his back on her, his shoulders rigid. You think you love me. You love the idea of your own survival. You're suffering from a trauma bond, Sierra. Stockholm Syndrome. It's not real. His words were more brutal than any punishment he had ever devised. They were designed to maim, to destroy the very foundation of what she felt. You're a liar, she whispered, her voice trembling with fury and hurt. You're a coward. He flinched but didn't turn. Perhaps, but my cowardice will give you a chance at a real life, the one you were always meant to have, the one I stole from you. He walked away from her, out of the concert hall, his footsteps echoing with finality. The days that followed were a new kind of imprisonment. Kane was a ghost. He moved out of the master suite, taking up residence in a guest wing. He was never home for meals. When they passed in the hall, he was polite, distant, a CEO dealing with a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The connection that had been a tangible electric force between them was gone, severed by his own hand. He was systematically dismantling their world brick by brick, and offering her the freedom she no longer wanted. The final blow came a week later. She was in her room when a courier delivered a package. Inside was a set of keys, a deed, and a letter from a prestigious music conservatory. The keys were to her old apartment, which Kane had secretly purchased and fully restored. The deed was to a small, charming studio space downtown, perfect for piano lessons. The letter was an offer for a full scholarship and a teaching position at the conservatory, an opportunity she had dreamed of a lifetime ago. It was a perfect, beautiful, heartbreaking prison break. He had rebuilt her old life piece by piece and was gently, ruthlessly, pushing her back into it. He was giving her everything she had lost, believing with every broken piece of his soul that he was unworthy of being part of it. That night she stood in the living room, the documents in her hand. He stood across from her, waiting. "This is your final answer?" she asked, her voice hollow. "It's the only honorable one I have left," he replied, his gaze fixed on the city lights. She looked at the keys in her hand. They represented safety, normalcy, the path of least resistance. They represented the woman she used to be. She looked at him. He represented the fire, the pain, the impossible heights and devastating depths. He represented the woman she had become. And he was rejecting them both. With a quiet nod that cost her everything, she turned and walked to the elevator. She didn't pack a bag. She left behind the silk robes, the stunning gowns, the ghost of the pianist he had cherished. She stepped into the elevator, the keys to her old life clutched in her cold hand. As the doors slid shut, she saw him still standing there, a solitary, broken king in his empty castle, granting her freedom because he believed it was the only thing he could ever truly give her. The elevator descended, and for the first time since this began, Sierra was completely, utterly, and absolutely alone. Her old apartment was a museum of a ghost. Kane's people had restored it perfectly. The same furniture, the same art on the walls, even her old piano, meticulously tuned, sat in the corner. But it was all a beautiful replica. The life that had once inhabited these rooms was gone. The woman who had lived here was gone. The emptiness of her apartment was a physical ache. It was then she realized the terrible, beautiful truth. Kane Thorne, in his brutal, broken way, had not imprisoned her. He had set her free. And now, by pushing her away, he was building the only prison that could truly hold her, a prison of his own making, built from the bricks of his guilt and self-loathing. The news broke on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A financial channel was playing on the small TV in her kitchen, background noise to her solitude. In a stunning move that has sent shockwaves through the global markets, a news anchor was saying, her voice crisp with excitement. Billionaire mogul Kane Thorne has announced the systematic dismantling of Thorne Industries. Insiders report he is selling off assets at an unprecedented rate, liquidating his entire empire. Sierra froze, a cup of tea halfway to her lips. In a press conference, Kane stood at the podium, his shoulders stooped, his famous intensity replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. The sharp, commanding gaze was extinguished. "Why, Mr. Thorn?" a reporter shouted. "Why walk away from all of this?" Kane looked directly into the camera, and for a heart-stopping second, Sierra felt he was looking right at her. "Some legacies are built on sand," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, devoid of its former power. "Some foundations are cracked beyond repair. It's not walking away. It's penance." Penance. The word echoed in the silent apartment. This wasn't a business decision, it was a suicide of the soul. He was erasing himself from the world, atom by atom, because he believed the man he had been to win his war, the man he had been with her, was a monster who deserved to be erased. He was doing this for her. He was burning his kingdom to the ground because he believed its shadow would forever darken any life she could have. He believed he was irredeemable. And in that moment, Sierra knew with absolute certainty that she could not let him. Love wasn't just about passion or need. It was about refusal. It was about refusing to let the person you love be consumed by their own darkness. She had to go to him, not to beg, not to demand, but to bear witness, to stand before him and be the living proof that he was wrong. The lobby of the Thorn Spire was no longer a fortress. It was a mausoleum. Boxes were stacked against the marble walls. The security desk was empty. Her footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space as she walked to the private elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs. She half expected it to be locked, but the doors slid open at her touch, as if expecting her. The ascent was silent. When the doors opened onto the penthouse, the air was cold. The climate control had been shut off. The vast open space was almost entirely empty. The art was gone. The furniture was gone. The grand piano had been removed from the concert hall. Only the floor-to-ceiling windows remained, framing a city that he was now surrendering. And there, in the center of the cavernous, empty room, stood Kane. He was staring out at the skyline, his back to her. He wore a simple dark shirt and trousers, a stark contrast to the bespoke suits that had once been his armor. He seemed smaller, as if the act of dismantling his power had physically diminished him. He was no longer a king or a captor. He was just a man, a shell of the powerful force he once was, consumed by a guilt so vast it had hollowed him out. He didn't turn. He must have heard the elevator. He must have known it was her. "I have nothing left to give you." His voice was raw, stripped bare. "It's almost done. Soon there will be no Kane Thorn. Just a name on some forgotten paperwork." She didn't speak. Words were the currency of their old world. Bargains, threats, psychological warfare. That world was gone. She simply walked toward him. Each step on the cold, bare marble was a step away from the woman she had been, and a step toward the woman, the partner, she was meant to be. He flinched when she was just a foot behind him, as if her proximity was a physical pain. This was the reckoning. She reached out and laid a hand on his back, between his shoulder blades. He shuddered violently under her touch, a tremor that ran through his entire frame. He was so starved for compassion, for a touch that wasn't a transaction or a confrontation, that the simple gesture nearly broke him. Slowly, she moved around to stand before him. He refused to look at her, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point out the window, fighting a losing battle for control. She gently placed her hands on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its frantic, galloping rhythm against her palm. Finally, she cupped his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. His eyes were shattered. The icy blue was a stormy sea of agony. She rose onto her toes and brought her lips to his. It began as a kiss of forgiveness and acceptance. Soft, a mere brushing of lips, a silent communion. But then, something fractured. A broken sound, half sob, half groan, escaped him. His control, the last vestige of the wall he'd built around himself, crumbled. His hands flew up, tangling in her hair, not with reverence but with a desperate, clawing need. The kiss exploded. It was no longer gentle. It was a conflagration. This was the reckoning. His mouth devoured hers, hot and hungry and tasting of salt and despair. It was a kiss of starvation, of a man who had denied himself the very air he breathed. She met his fury with her own, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body arching into the hard, unyielding line of his. This wasn't just forgiveness. It was a battle for his very soul, and she would fight him with every ounce of her passion. They sank to the floor, a tangle of frantic limbs and tearing fabric. The slow, painstaking undressing was gone, replaced by a raw urgency. Buttons strained and popped. His shirt was ripped open. Her blouse was pushed roughly from her shoulders. There was no time for tenderness, only the desperate, vital need to feel skin against skin, to confirm they were both alive, both here, both real. His hands were everywhere, scorching paths down her spine, cupping her hips to grind her against the rigid proof of his want, tangling again in her hair to angle her mouth for a deeper, more devastating kiss. He worshipped her with a bruising intensity, his mouth leaving a burning trail from her lips to her jaw, down the column of her throat, to the frantic pulse at its base. Sierra, he growled against her skin, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. God, what have I done? Sierra, he growled against her skin, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. God, what have I done? This, she gasped out, her head falling back as his mouth found the edge of her front, his tongue laving her peaked point with a rough, possessive stroke that made her cry out. Do this, don't stop. He was trembling, but not from weakness. It was the vibration of a dam breaking. He parted her with a firm, knowing hand, his fingers finding her and ready. It was slow, tender, and devastatingly emotional. There were no words, only the language of touch. This time, it was not about conquest or payment. It was about healing. Every gentle stroke was a suture closing a wound. Every shuddering breath was a ghost being released. When their bodies finally joined, it was with a sense of homecoming so profound it felt like a birth. It was quiet, raw, and real, a silent vow exchanged in the ruins of their old selves, promising to build something new, together. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the hard floor, wrapped in his discarded shirt, the city lights painting shifting patterns on their skin. He was still inside her, and she could feel the frantic beat of his heart finally begin to slow, to sync with her own. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time, no longer full of ice or agony, but brimming with a quiet, awe-filled wonder. Sierra finally broke the silence, her voice a soft whisper in the vast, empty space. You don't get to erase yourself, she said. Your penance isn't destruction. It's redemption, and you don't get to do it alone. For the first time since she had returned, a genuine, fragile peace settled over his features. The shell of the man was gone. The man himself, wounded but worthy, had been found. The silence in the empty penthouse was no longer cold. It was a blanket wrapping around them as they lay on the floor, limbs entangled, breathing in sync. The marble was hard beneath them, but the feel of his skin against hers, the steady, strong beat of his heart under her palm, it was the most profound comfort she had ever known. He had not erased himself. He had been found. And in finding him, she had found the final missing piece of herself. 1 year later, the air in the concert hall was electric, thick with the anticipation of 1,000 people holding their breath. On stage, under a single brilliant spotlight, Sierra's hands flew across the keys of the grand piano. This was not the private hall in Kane's prison. This was the Royal Festival Hall, and the piece was her own, a complex, soaring composition titled Redemption in C-sharp minor. It was a story in music. It began with dissonant, anxious chords, the sound of a shattered life of fear and imprisonment. It moved into a slow, painful adagio, a melody of confusion and reluctant awakening. Then, a powerful, crashing crescendo represented the clash of wills, the fight for survival. And finally it resolved into a breathtakingly beautiful and joyful theme, a testament to love forged in fire, To peace, hard won. As the final, triumphant note hung in the air, the silence held for a heart-stopping second before the hall erupted. The roar of the crowd was a physical force. They were on their feet, shouting, weeping, applauding not just a performance, but a resurrection. Backstage was a controlled chaos of well-wishers, stage managers, and reporters. Sierra accepted a bouquet of flowers, her smile genuine but her eyes searching the crowd. And then, she saw him. Kane stood by the door, apart from the throng. He wasn't the hollowed-out ghost from the empty penthouse, nor the ruthless titan from a year ago. He was something new, something solid and real. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet, fierce pride that made her heart swell. He didn't rush. He let the wave of admirers ebb around her, waiting his turn with a patience the old Kane would have scorned. When he finally walked toward her, the crowd seemed to part instinctively. He took her hands, his thumbs stroking her knuckles, his touch now a familiar language of love and possession, freely given and freely accepted. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice low, for her alone. "You laid your soul bare, and they felt every note of it." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that stripped away the noise of the room. "That first day," he began, his voice low and earnest, stripped of all its former arrogance, filled only with raw truth. "I told you I owned your pleasure. I was a broken man trying to steal a feeling I'd forgotten, trying to command a light I could no longer create." He brought one of her hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her palm. "I didn't own you, Sierra. You rebuilt me. Every reluctant sigh, every tear of shame, every moment of your defiant strength, they chiseled away the stone around my heart. You weren't my prisoner. You were my redemption." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy filled her eyes. It was the final bargain. Not a transaction of pleasure for freedom, but a sacred exchange. His brutal honesty for her fierce compassion, his broken pieces for her healing touch. They were even. They were whole. Their new home was not a penthouse fortress, but a sprawling, light-filled loft overlooking the river. It was filled with art they had chosen together, books they both read, and the constant, gentle sound of a piano. It was a home, not a cage. Later that night, bathed in the soft glow of city lights filtering through the windows, they came together. There was no frantic hunger, no desperate clinging. There was only a slow, deep, reverent exploration. Their intimacy was a quiet, profound celebration. His hands, once instruments of clinical domination, now worshipped her skin with a lover's patience. Her touches, once given in reluctant trade, now mapped the landscape of his body with joyful ownership. He kissed the faint silvery line on her side, a permanent reminder of the night Liam was shot. "My brave lioness," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She traced the new lines of peace around his eyes, the ones that had replaced the grim brackets of stress. "My love," she breathed back. There was laughter, soft and breathless, as they fumbled with buttons. There were whispered secrets, dreams for the future, silly fears, memories of the day. The power struggle was a forgotten ghost. In its place was the joyful, equal partnership of two people who had walked through fire and emerged hand in hand stronger and whole. When they finally joined, it was with a sense of perfect, seamless rightness. It was slow and deep, a languid, rolling wave of sensation that built not toward a shattering climax, but toward a peak of such profound connection it felt like flying. It was a union of souls as much as bodies, a silent vow reaffirmed with every synchronized breath, every beat of their hearts pressed together. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other, limbs tangled in the cool sheets, the sound of their slowing breaths a gentle rhythm in the dark. His arm was a solid weight around her, her head pillowed on his chest. There were no more words needed. The journey was complete. The gilded cage was a distant memory. The executioner was gone. The beast was tamed by love. The pianist had found her symphony. They were finally free. They were finally home.